"What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as Lily's fingers brushed against my cheek. Her touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine that I couldn't suppress. Her eyes, usually so composed, now held a fire that made my heart race. "What does it look like?" she replied, her voice soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. Desire? Certainty? Her lips were so close I could feel her breath mingling with mine, warm and intoxicating. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This isn't right. She's my stepsister. But the way she was looking at me, the way her body leaned into mine, made it impossible to think straight. My hand instinctively moved to her waist, feeling the curve of her hip beneath my fingers. And then, without warning, she closed the distance between us. It had started innocently enough, like most things do. She was Lily, my stepsister, sure, but more than that, she was my confidant, my partner in crime, the one person I could always count on. We'd been thrown together when our parents married a few years back, and though we'd never been close before, living under the same roof had changed that. But lately, something had shifted. It began with little things, lingering glances, casual touches that lasted a heartbeat too long. At first, I told myself it was nothing. She's just being friendly, I thought. But then there was that night in the kitchen. We were both standing at the counter, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. She'd just finished washing the dishes, and I was drying them, our hands brushing every so often as we passed plates back and forth. It was a routine we'd done countless times before, but this time it felt different. "You're quiet tonight," she remarked, her voice breaking the silence. She turned to face me, leaning against the counter with that familiar smirk playing on her lips. "Just tired," I replied, though the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about us, about how close we'd become, and how, somewhere along the line, those feelings had started to change. She tilted her head, studying me with those piercing green eyes. "You sure that's all it is?" I hesitated, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah." "Why?" She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving mine. "Because you've been acting different around me lately." I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "Different how?" "Like you're hiding something." Her voice was soft, almost teasing, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm not hiding anything," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she just stood there, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to pry the truth out of me. And then, as if some invisible force had pulled her forward, she closed the gap between us, her lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. I froze, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. This is wrong, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt right, like something that had been building for months, maybe even years, and now, finally, it had been unleashed. Her hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I let her. I couldn't help myself. My arms wrapped around her waist, holding her like she might disappear if I let go. The kiss deepened, her tongue brushing against mine, and I felt a rush of heat that I couldn't ignore. But then, just as quickly as it had started, it ended. She pulled back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, desire, maybe even regret, that made me wonder if she really meant it. "Lily," I started, but she cut me off. "Don't," she said, shaking her head. "Just don't." And with that, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my mind reeling. The days that followed were tense, to say the least. We were both careful around each other, avoiding anything that could be misconstrued as intimate. But it was impossible to ignore the electricity that crackled between us every time we were in the same room. Then, one night, it happened again. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV show, when she turned to me, her eyes dark with desire. Without a word, she leaned in and kissed me, and this time, there was no hesitation. "Is this okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. Instead, I kissed her back, my hands moving to her waist as I pulled her onto my lap. "This is wrong," I murmured against her lips, though my body was telling me otherwise. "I know," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear, "but I don't care." And in that moment, neither did I. A week later, we found ourselves sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the weight of what we'd done hanging heavy in the air. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know," I replied, though the thought of stopping made my chest ache. "I think," she hesitated, biting her lip, "I think we need to take a break from each other, just to figure things out." I nodded, though I hated the idea. Okay. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine. This doesn't mean I don't feel what I feel. I need time. I squeezed her hand, my heart heavy with the weight of our shared guilt and longing. Take all the time you need. But as I sat there, staring at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. And part of me didn't want to. Lily, I started, but she shook her head. Don't, she said, her voice breaking. Just don't. And with that, she stood up and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the undeniable truth that I was in love with my stepsister. The days after Lily walked away felt like an eternity. The house, once filled with her presence, now felt emptier than ever. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, reading, even attempting to cook, but my mind always wandered back to her. The way her lips had felt against mine, the warmth of her body pressing into me, the fire in her eyes that had both terrified and exhilarated me. It was all I could think about. I told myself it was for the best, that taking a break was the responsible thing to do. But every time I heard her footsteps in the hallway or caught a glimpse of her from the corner of my eye, my heart would race, and I'd feel that same pull, that same undeniable connection. One evening, I was in the living room, pretending to watch TV, when she walked in. She looked as beautiful as ever, her hair loose and cascading over her shoulders, her green eyes bright but guarded. She hesitated at the doorway, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her shirt. "Hey," she said softly, her voice wavering just slightly. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out more strained than I intended. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, like a storm waiting to break. She walked over and sat down on the opposite end of the couch, leaving a careful distance between us. But even that small space felt like a chasm, and I could feel the heat radiating from her, drawing me in. "How are you?" she asked, her eyes not meeting mine. "I've been better," I admitted, my hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion. "How about you?" She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Same. I thought this would be easier." "Me too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we sat in silence, the only sound the low hum of the TV in the background. But the silence was heavy, charged with unspoken words and suppressed desires. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the urge to reach out to her almost unbearable. Then, she turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine. "Do you ever think about what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard. All the time, I wanted to say, every damn second, but instead I just nodded. "Yeah, I do." Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were now clasped tightly in her lap. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I tried to convince myself it was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened, but then I remember how it felt, and I just can't. I felt a surge of emotion, guilt, desire, fear, all swirling together in a dizzying mix. "Lily," I started, but she cut me off. "No, let me finish," she said, her voice firmer now. "I know it's wrong. I know we're step-siblings, and we shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. I can't stop it, and I don't want to." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the air leave my lungs. I wanted to tell her she was crazy, that we were crazy, and that this could never work. But as I looked into her eyes, all I saw was honesty, raw and unfiltered, and I knew I couldn't lie to her or to myself. "I don't want to stop it either," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at me, as if she couldn't believe what I'd just said. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand on mine. Her touch was electric, sending a jolt of warmth through my body. "Then let's not stop," she said, her voice steady now, her eyes filled with determination. "Let's not pretend anymore. Let's just be honest with each other about what we want." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could feel the heat of her hand on mine, the way her body was leaning slightly towards me, as if drawn by some invisible force. I wanted to kiss her so badly it hurt, but I hesitated. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Because once we do this, there's no going back." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in closer, her lips just inches from mine, her breath warm against my skin. Her eyes were locked onto mine, and in them, I saw everything: her fear, her desire, her need. And then, she kissed me. It wasn't like the kisses we'd shared before. Those had been hesitant, unsure, laced with guilt and confusion. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Her lips pressed against mine with a fierce urgency, and I could feel the pent-up emotions pouring out of her. Her longing, her frustration, her love. I kissed her back with equal intensity, my hands moving to her waist, pulling her closer to me. She let out a small moan as our bodies pressed together, her hands tangling in my hair. The world around us seemed to fade away, and all I could focus on was her, the feel of her, the taste of her, the way she made me feel alive in a way I never had before. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our chests rising and falling in sync. Her eyes were dark with desire, and I could see the same fire in her that I felt in myself. "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't hesitate. "Yes, God, yes. This is what I want. You are what I want." She smiled then, a small, relieved smile, and she leaned in to kiss me again. But this time, it was slower, more tender, as if she was savoring every moment. My hands slid up her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through her shirt, and I could feel her shiver under my touch. "Lily," I whispered against her lips, my voice filled with awe and desire. "I'm here," she murmured back, her hands moving to unbutton my shirt. "And I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers brushed against my chest, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. My hands moved to her waist, and I pulled her onto my lap, her legs straddling mine. She let out a soft gasp as our bodies pressed together, and I could feel the heat building between us. "You're so beautiful," I whispered, my hands moving to cup her face. "I've wanted this for so long." "Me too," she replied, her voice breathless. "I've wanted you for so long." Her words sent a wave of heat through me, and I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands moving to explore her body. She moaned softly into my mouth, her hips rocking against mine, and I could feel the tension building between us, a coiled spring ready to snap. "Lily," I whispered, my voice hoarse with need. "I want you, all of you." She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Once we do this, there's no going back." I didn't hesitate. "I'm sure," I said, my voice firm. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She smiled then, a small, relieved smile, and she leaned in to kiss me again. But this time, it was different, slower, more deliberate, as if she was savoring every moment. My hands trembled as they traced the curve of her waist, the soft fabric of her shirt bunching under my fingertips. Lily's breath hitched, warm against my lips, and her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer. The air between us was charged, electric, and every nerve in my body was alive, throbbing with a need I could no longer ignore. She broke the kiss, her chest rising and falling as she looked at me, her green eyes dark with desire. "We shouldn't," she murmured, but her voice was weak, unconvincing, and her body leaned into mine, contradicting her words. "We already crossed the line," I said, my voice low, rough with want. "There's no point in pretending anymore." Her gaze flickered, uncertainty warring with hunger, but then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her hands slid down my chest, fingers fumbling with the buttons of my shirt. I didn't stop her, couldn't. Instead, I watched her, captivated by the intensity in her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When my shirt hung open, she paused, her fingers brushing against my skin, sending shivers through me. "You're so warm," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and she leaned in, pressing her lips to the hollow of my throat. Her kiss was soft, tentative at first, but then her tongue flicked out, tasting me, and a low groan escaped my lips. "Lily," I breathed, my hands moving to her hips, pulling her closer. "You're driving me crazy." She smirked against my skin, her teeth grazing lightly, and I felt my knees weaken. Her hands slid up my chest, pushing the shirt off my shoulders, and it fell to the floor, forgotten. Her fingers traced the lines of my muscles, exploring with a curiosity that made my heart race. "You're so perfect," she murmured, her voice trembling with awe, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "Is this really okay?" I cupped her face in my hands, forcing her to meet my gaze. "More than okay," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I want this. I want you." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes searching mine. Then she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and her hands moved to the hem of her shirt. She hesitated, her fingers trembling, and I reached out, covering her hands with mine. "Let me," I whispered, and she nodded again, her breathing shallow as I slowly lifted her shirt over her head, revealing the smooth, pale skin beneath. My mouth went dry as I took her in, the curve of her shoulders, the delicate dip of her collarbone. the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She was beautiful, perfect, and she was mine. I leaned in, pressing my lips to her shoulder, and she shivered, her hands gripping my arms for support. My kisses trailed down her collarbone, each one eliciting a soft gasp from her, and when my lips brushed the swell of her breast, she moaned, her head falling back. "God, you're amazing," I murmured against her skin, and my hands moved to her back, unhooking her bra with practiced ease. It fell away, and I pulled back slightly, taking in the sight of her, bare and trembling before me. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, but I caught her chin, tilting her face back to mine. "Don't hide," I said softly. "You're beautiful, Lily, every inch of you." Her eyes welled with tears, and she bit her lip, nodding. "I've never done this before," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, not like this." My heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice, and I pulled her into my arms, holding her close. "We'll take it slow," I promised, my lips brushing against her ear. "We'll figure it out together." She nodded, clinging to me, and I could feel her trembling against me. But there was a determination in her eyes when she looked up at me, a fire that hadn't been there before. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Her words sent a surge of warmth through me, and I kissed her, slow and deep, pouring everything I felt into the touch. Her hands moved to my waist, fumbling with the button of my jeans, and I didn't stop her. Instead, I helped her, undoing the button and sliding them down over my hips. She followed suit, stripping off her own jeans, and then we were standing there, bare and vulnerable, the air between us thick with anticipation. I reached for her, pulling her into my arms, and she melted against me, her skin warm and soft against mine. "Are you sure?" I whispered, my lips brushing against her ear. "We can stop if you..." "Don't stop," she interrupted, her voice firm, and she looked up at me, her eyes blazing with determination. "I want this. I want you." Her words sent a jolt of desire through me, and I kissed her again, hard and demanding, my hands roaming her body, exploring every curve, every inch of her. She moaned into my mouth, her hands gripping my shoulders, and I lifted her, carrying her to the bed and laying her down gently. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and trusting, and I knelt over her, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'll be gentle," I promised, and she nodded, her hands moving to my hips, pulling me closer. "I trust you," she whispered, and then there was no more talking, no more doubts, just the two of us, lost in each other, crossing a line we could never uncross. Her gasp when I entered her was soft, almost too soft to hear, but it sent a shockwave through me, and I stilled, giving her time to adjust. Her nails dug into my back, and she arched against me, her breath hitching. "You feel so good," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't stop." I couldn't. My movements were slow at first, careful, but her whimpers and moans spurred me on, and soon we were moving together, a rhythm as natural as breathing. Her hands moved over my body, exploring, claiming, and I did the same, memorizing every sound, every touch. "Lily," I breathed, her name a prayer on my lips. "You're perfect, so perfect." She cried out then, her body tightening around me, and I followed her over the edge, lost in the haze of pleasure and emotion. When it was over, we lay there, tangled together, our hearts pounding in unison. Her head rested on my chest, and I could feel her trembling, her breathing still ragged. "That was..." she began, but her voice trailed off and she shook her head. "I don't have words." I kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "Neither do I admitted, and she laughed softly, the sound music to my ears. We lay there in silence for a while, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. But for once, there was no guilt, no fear, just the two of us, taking comfort in each other's presence. Eventually, she shifted, propping herself up on her elbow to look at me. Her hair was tousled, her eyes soft, and she looked more beautiful than ever. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We figure it out," I said. "Together." She nodded, leaning in to kiss me softly. "Together," she agreed, and then her lips were on mine again. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the room. I stirred, feeling the warmth of Lily's body pressed against mine. Her breath was steady, her arm draped across my chest in a way that felt so natural, so right, it was almost hard to remember why it had ever felt wrong. I glanced down at her, tracing the curve of her shoulder with my fingertips, marveling at how peaceful she looked in sleep. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, we just lay there, staring at each other. There was something unspoken in that gaze, something heavy and charged, as if we both knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But instead of fear, there was a quiet acceptance, a sense that whatever came next, we'd face it together. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. My fingers lingered, tracing the line of her cheekbone, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. We didn't say much as we got up, the silence between us comfortable, almost reverent. But as we moved around the kitchen, making breakfast, I couldn't help but notice the way her gaze lingered on me, the way her movements seemed slower, more deliberate. It was as if every glance, every brush of our hands, carried a weight it hadn't before. She caught me staring at one point, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "What?" she asked, her tone teasing but with an undercurrent of something deeper. "Nothing," I said quickly, feeling my face heat. But she wasn't fooled. She stepped closer, her eyes locking with mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. "You're staring," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I can't help it," I admitted, my heart racing. You're beautiful." Her smile widened, and she moved even closer until there was hardly any space between us. "And you're," she paused, as if searching for the right word, "completely irresistible." Before I could respond, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, almost hesitant, but filled with so much promise it took my breath away. It was different from the kisses we'd shared before, less desperate, more deliberate, as if we were both savoring the moment, letting it stretch out between us. When she finally pulled away, I was left breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lily?" I started, but she shook her head, placing a finger over my lips. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't overthink it. Just let it be, for now." I nodded, swallowing hard. She was right. Overthinking had only ever gotten us into trouble before. And as much as my brain was screaming at me to analyze every word, every touch, I knew she was right. This was something we needed to feel, not think about. We spent the rest of the morning in what felt like a bubble, the outside world far away and irrelevant. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake feeling that we were just delaying the inevitable. The world wasn't going to stay away forever, and neither were the complications. By late afternoon, the tension that had been simmering between us all day finally boiled over. We were sitting on the couch, her legs draped over mine, when she turned to me, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. My stomach dropped, but I nodded. "Okay." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I can't keep pretending this is just casual. I can't keep acting like this isn't a big deal, because it is. It's a huge deal." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same way." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, it felt like she was looking straight into my soul. "Do you? Because I need to know that we're on the same page here. That us, isn't just some temporary thing. That it's real." "It's real," I said, my voice steady even as my heart was racing. "I've never felt anything like this before, for anyone. And I know it's complicated, and I know it's not going to be easy, but I don't care. I want this. I want you." Her eyes softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "I want you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than anything." We sat there for a moment, her words hanging in the air between us, heavy with meaning. And then, before I could think, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. This kiss was fire and need and everything we'd been holding back, and it left us both breathless. When we finally pulled apart, she was looking at me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my mind racing. What now? It was the question we'd been avoiding, the one that hung over us like a storm cloud. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to run from it. I didn't feel the need to pretend that everything was okay, because it wasn't. But that didn't mean we couldn't figure it out. "We take it one day at a time," I said finally, my voice steady. "We face whatever comes next together." She nodded, her expression serious but resolute. "Together?" she agreed, and then her lips were on mine again, her body pressing close, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the tangled sheets, and the warmth of Lily's body pressed against mine. Her fingers traced lazy patterns on my chest, her touch light but deliberate, as if she was memorizing every inch of me. I could feel her heartbeat against my side, steady and reassuring. a rhythm that made it hard to believe we'd ever been anything but this. But the truth lingered, unspoken, in the quiet space between us. "Do you ever think about what people would say?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her tone was soft but laced with a tension that made my stomach tighten. I turned my head to look at her, my brow furrowing. "All the time," I admitted, my voice just as quiet. "But it doesn't change how I feel about you." She propped herself up on one elbow, her green eyes searching mine. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We can't just pretend this is normal. It's not." I reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I know it's not," I said, my thumb grazing her cheek. "But I also know that what we have, it's real. And I don't want to lose that." She sighed, her gaze dropping to my chest as she traced the line of my collarbone. "I don't either," she whispered. "But what if we're just setting ourselves up for pain? What if this ruins us?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I sat up slightly, pulling her closer so that her head rested on my shoulder. "I don't have all the answers," I said, my voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside me. "But I know that I'd rather take the risk with you than live without you." She was silent for a long moment, her breath warm against my skin. Then, slowly, she lifted her head to meet my gaze. "You really mean that?" I nodded, my hand cupping her face. Every word. Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile, and she leaned in, her mouth brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, filled with a quiet intensity. When she pulled back, her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "So am I," I said, my thumb wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "But we'll figure it out, together." She nodded, her smile growing a little stronger. "Together?" she repeated, and then her lips were on mine again, this time with more urgency, her body pressing closer as if she was trying to erase the doubts that lingered between us. I kissed her back, my hands moving to her waist, pulling her onto my lap. Her breath hitched as my fingers slid under her shirt, tracing the curve of her spine. She arched into my touch, her hands tangling in my hair as the kiss deepened, fear and uncertainty momentarily forgotten. Our bodies moved together in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, every touch, every kiss, every whispered word a reminder of the connection we shared. It was as if we were trying to convince ourselves that this was enough, that this moment, this closeness, could somehow outweigh the complications that loomed on the horizon. But even as we lost ourselves in each other, the questions lingered, unspoken but undeniable. What would happen when we had to face the world outside these walls? What would happen when reality caught up with us? I don't know, I thought, my hands gripping her hips as she rocked against me. But I don't care. And for that moment, I didn't. Later, as we lay tangled together, the room bathed in the soft light of midday, Lily's head rested on my chest, her fingers idly playing with the hem of my shirt. "We should tell them," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Tell who?" She lifted her head to look at me, her expression serious. "Our parents." The words hit me like a gut punch, and I sat up slightly, my eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before she looked back at me. "No," she admitted, "but I can't keep living like this, pretending that nothing's changed. I don't want to hide anymore." I reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "It's going to be messy," I said, my voice low. "It could change everything." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered, "but I think it's worth it. Aren't you tired of pretending?" The question cut through me, the truth of it undeniable. I was tired of the lies, tired of the guilt, tired of the fear that we'd be found out. But the thought of facing our parents, of exposing this fragile, beautiful thing we'd built, was terrifying. I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But are you ready for what comes next?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on my chest. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think we have to try." I pulled her closer, my arms wrapping around her as I pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then we'll do it," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "Together." She nodded, her body relaxing against mine. "Together?" she repeated, and for a moment, it felt like we could face anything. But as the reality of what we were about to do settled over us, the tension in the room grew, the weight of it pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. "When?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, my arms tightening around her. "Tonight," I said. "After dinner." She nodded, her fingers clutching my shirt as if she was afraid to let go. "Okay," she whispered. "Tonight." We lay there in silence, the closeness of our bodies a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, steady but quick, as if she was just as anxious as I was. "I love you," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. The words caught me off guard, and I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking into me like a stone dropped into still water. "I love you," she had said, and now those three little words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning and consequence. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, joy, fear, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name, something raw and primal. I cupped her face in my hands, my thumbs brushing over her cheeks. "I love you too," I whispered, the words escaping my lips before I could think better of them. It was the truth, and yet it felt like a confession, a secret I'd been holding on to for far too long. Her eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and relief flashing across her face. And then she leaned in, her lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. Our bodies pressed together, the heat between us building with every passing second. Her hands slid under my shirt, her fingers tracing the curve of my spine, sending shivers down my back. I could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest against mine, the way her heart was pounding in sync with my own. It was as if we were caught in a storm, the intensity of our emotions threatening to consume us both. "Lily," I murmured against her lips, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk about this, about what we're doing." She pulled back slightly, her green eyes searching mine. "I know," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to stop. I can't. Not now." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. She was right, stopping now felt impossible. The pull between us was too strong, the connection too deep to sever. But the reality of our situation loomed over us like a dark cloud, the knowledge that what we were doing was wrong by society's standards gnawing at the edges of my conscience. "What about tonight?" I asked, my voice strained. "When we tell them, what if they don't understand? What if they—" I trailed off, unable to voice the worst-case scenario. Lily's expression softened, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair away from my face. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll face it together. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out." Her words were a comfort, but they didn't completely ease the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. Still, I nodded, my resolve firming. Together, I agreed, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. We lay there for a while longer, the silence between us comfortable but charged with anticipation. Eventually, Lily sat up, her hair falling in a cascade over her shoulders. "We should get dressed," she said, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. "We've got a few hours before we have to do this." I nodded, reluctantly pulling myself out of bed. The cool air hit my skin as the warmth of her body left mine, and I shivered slightly. We moved around the room in silence, gathering our clothes and getting dressed. The intimacy of the morning lingered, though, a palpable energy that neither of us could ignore. As we headed downstairs, the reality of what we were about to do began to sink in. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. We sat at the kitchen table, our hands intertwined, as we waited for the inevitable. "What are we going to say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lily sighed, her fingers tightening around mine. "The truth," she said simply. "We'll tell them the truth and hope they understand." I nodded, though the thought of baring our souls to our parents sent a wave of nausea through me. But there was no other way. We had to face this head-on, no matter how terrifying it was. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. We tried to distract ourselves, watching TV, playing cards, anything to keep our minds off the impending conversation, but nothing worked. The tension in the air was too thick, too oppressive. Finally, the sound of the front door opening broke the silence. My heart leapt into my throat, and I instinctively tightened my grip on Lily's hand. She squeezed back, her expression calm but resolute. "We've got this," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I nodded, taking a deep breath as we heard footsteps approaching the kitchen. The door swung open, and our parents walked in, their faces lighting up with smiles when they saw us. "Hey kids," my dad said, setting his keys on the counter. "What's going on?" Lily and I exchanged a glance, and then she took a deep breath, her voice strong as she spoke. "We need to talk to you, both of you." Our parents exchanged a look of confusion, but they sat down at the table, their expressions turning serious. I could feel the weight of their gazes on us, and I had to fight the urge to look away. "What is it?" my mom asked, her tone gentle but concerned. Lily took another deep breath, her hand still gripping mine tightly. We're in love," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her words. "We're in love with each other." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could see the shock on our parents' faces, the way their eyes widened and their mouths opened slightly as they processed what they had just heard. "What?" my dad finally asked, his voice strained. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "We know it's unconventional," I said, my voice shaky, "but it's the truth. We love each other." The silence stretched on, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. My mom was the first to speak, her voice soft but filled with disbelief. "But you're siblings." "Step-siblings," Lily corrected, her tone firm. "And we didn't plan this. It just happened. We didn't want it to, but we can't deny it anymore." My dad ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of confusion and frustration. This isn't right. Your family. You can't do this." "Dad," I said, my voice pleading. "We know it's complicated, but we're not going to stop. We can't." My mom shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You're making a mistake." Lily's grip on my hand tightened, and I could feel her trembling slightly. "We're not making a mistake," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We love each other, and we're going to be together, no matter what you say." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words pressing down on all of us. I could see the conflict in our parents' eyes, the struggle between their love for us and their shock at what we were telling them. Finally, my dad sighed, his shoulders slumping. We need time to process this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. This is a lot." Lily and I exchanged a glance, and then she nodded. "Take your time," she said softly, "but our feelings won't change." We stood in silence as our parents left the room, their faces pale and their steps slow. The moment they were gone, I turned to Lily, my heart pounding in my chest. "What now?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her green eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "Now," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "We wait."